I'll see you guys in the dark.
I was a high school senior and part of what you would call the popular kids, which meant when my friend David told me he was going to have a party out in the woods on Halloween night, I just knew there would be trouble. David's parties were always notorious for getting pretty wild, but that was to be expected. We lived in a small town where the best thing to do with your free time was either loiter around the library or go for a drive for the sake of driving. When a party was happening around here, next to everyone in our school showed up. You didn't really need an invite so much as just to know where the thing was being held. That fall was particularly bad for having nothing to do for us teens. Trick or treat was a bit past us at that point, and it was tricky to get our hands on any horror movies to watch with our limited resources and the lack of a video store. This would be the first and last time to memory that there would be a party out in those woods, not that I knew it at the time. David told us all about his little plan in the first week of October, so we all suddenly became a lot more focused on coming up with cool costumes to wear to impress our classmates and not our studies. A fact that made my parents already a bit annoyed with me, but I kept in their good books by doing extra chores around the house. When the night did finally come, I ended up going as a zombie. Pretty cliche, I know, but I put a little extra into it. One of my favorite subjects in school was art, specifically anything that had to do with painting and textures. I used what little skills I had to paint myself up in a sickly gray color first. Across the parts of me that would be visible, I put bloody gashes and festering wounds. I'd have to take one hell of a shower the next day, but it'd be so worth it. Over the top of that, I slipped on an old shirt I had picked up from the thrift store and ripped to hell to make plenty of ragged holes. A set of matching pants and old shoes which were falling apart already, without further change to them, closed off the ensemble. The last addition to my costume, I wouldn't paint on until after I was out the door and in my friend's old pickup truck. My parents weren't exactly thrilled with me going to the party in the first place, but if they saw the inverted cross I painted on my forehead, they would have flipped. They were old-fashioned, to say the least. Perhaps then, I only even wanted to add that to be extra edgy. Try to push the envelope. Without it, though, I sometimes wonder how things would have gone differently. We ended up arriving at the party a couple of hours late. My buddy had forgotten the beer he was going to bring, and he made us double back to his house to get it, which added to the already hour delay we had getting there. That was more than fine, though, because when we showed up to the party, already in progress with a couple of cases hoisted above our heads, we were met with a round of cheers. I had to hand it to David. The party was a hell of a lot better than I thought it would be. He must have had a few of the guys help him out because the entire place was decked out with decorations. A bonfire roared in the center of the party, giving it plenty of light along the other sources of light that had been set up. Crudely carved jack-o'-lanterns were scattered around the clearing, and best of all, there were plenty of snacks and drinks set up on a few folding tables. There must have been at least 100 people there when we arrived, and the majority were already buzzed. That meant that I was egged on to catch up as my friends dragged me into the mess of dancing and drinking, quickly diving headfirst into what the night had in store. The next couple of hours, the party was the typical fiasco. Dancing, music, hanging out on the sidelines or by the snacks. It was a real good time overall, and I had my fair share of drinks. I did, however, try to balance it out somewhat with some water. My parents didn't know about the booze that was going to be at the party, though they probably had their suspicions, so I had to try to be able to act at least somewhat sober when I got home. Eventually, though, the party started to thin out. 100 turned to 50, which eventually turned to around 20 people. All of us were huddled around the fire at this point, which was burning lower than it had been before, and some of the guys were doing their best attempts to tell scary stories to try to scare the girls. They were god-awful, but it made for some pretty good entertainment from the sidelines at least. From the sidelines, I felt the sudden call of nature and excused myself, staggering off into the bush to take care of it. Now, there were still enough people that I made sure to go deeper into the woods than I normally would to avoid being seen. Turns out, when you're a bit messed up, it can be kind of tricky to orientate yourself in the woods at night, even with the near full moon above. After I'd finished my business, I stumbled in what I thought was the direction of the party, only to find myself in deeper and deeper brush. I'm not sure how long I walked lost, as my sense of time was already way past gone, and the trees around me held no answers for that either. This walking was suddenly interrupted with a sharp scream that rang out somewhere in front of me. It sounded like a girl and was quickly followed by cries for help. I quickly looked around and picked up the heaviest looking branch I could find before going towards the sound. I wasn't exactly the bravest kid, but with a bit of alcohol and my adrenaline already on high from being lost, I ignored any signs of danger from a situation like this. Following the sounds of struggle, I eventually spotted the cause. From the distance, I could see a crimson-robed figure who was chasing after what looked like a girl covered in red. The only light there had been at this point was from the moon, but curiously enough, I could see what looked like lit torches on the nearby trees. I moved myself closer, keeping to the shadows cast by those torches as best I could, while the robed figure finally seemed to catch up to the girl and throw her against a tree. At that point, I was only maybe 20 feet away and watched as the guy pulled an all too real looking knife out from underneath his robe, raising it above the girl's head. With a shout, I charged the guy from behind with my heavy branch in hand. All they were able to do was whirl around and look at me before the branch connected hard with the side of their head. The robed figure fell to the ground with a thud, and their hood was knocked off, revealing a bald-headed man that had strange symbols painted across his face. I was breathing hard at that point, but I didn't take time to think about what those things might have meant. Now that I was closer to her, I realized that the girl was without any clothing at all. Most of her body instead was covered in what looked like to be a mixture of dried blood and those same kind of strange symbols. When I finally made eye contact with her from behind her long dark hair and asked if she was okay, I could have sworn that in her eyes I saw excitement. There had been some sort of flash of unnatural emotion when she looked up at me that, at that time, I never really processed. Before I had the chance to think about it, she quickly wrapped her arms around me crying and said she was fine but needed help. These guys had dragged her out into the woods and had been preparing her body for a ritual when she managed to escape. I tried to reassure her that she would be fine and gave her my name. She told me hers was Lillian. I gave her my t-shirt that I had on underneath my ruined dress shirt, and she put it on quickly before we left. It wouldn't be much, but at the very least, it would cover her up a bit. She took it and wiped the tears away from her eyes. I took the guy's knife off the ground as well. It had a handle that seemed to be coated in silver, a dark purple gem stuck to the bottom, and a black blade that was razor sharp. I must have been gone from the party for some time because it only took us maybe another 10 or 20 minutes before we could hear my friends shouting my name into the woods. Me and Lillian had moved quietly, trying to avoid any encounters with the crazy fucks that were out here, so we almost didn't come out at first until I spotted David with a flashlight in hand. I took Lillian by the hand and led her over to my friends. The lot of them were relieved to finally find me, but suddenly had a ton of questions when they saw who I was with and the state she was in. Then David saw my arm. He pointed to it and asked if that was part of my makeup. I looked over to where he was pointing and saw that my left sleeve was completely soaked with blood. Apparently, when the cultist guy had turned, he actually managed to get a quick slash in that struck me on the shoulder. It wasn't extremely deep, but obviously enough to have caused a lot of bleeding. Adrenaline must have made me not even realize it, but now that it was pointed out, it started to sting like a son of a bitch. I told them all what happened, and they probably wouldn't have believed me if I didn't have that wound. It was Halloween after all, and pranks around this time were always rampant. All of us made it back to camp in record time as they took my word that there was a good chance these woods had some crazy assholes looking to stab someone. When we got back, they managed to get the girl a pair of pants, as someone had an old pair in the back of their truck. Before putting them on though, she asked us if we had any wet cloths that she could use to wipe herself clean of the blood and marks. We ended up ripping a piece of cloth from one of the decorations that was a Grim Reaper. Well, they helped the girl, and I went to go and get a first aid kit that one of my survival buddies liked to keep in his glove compartment. Now, he had parked a better distance away than most of the vehicles, but it was still within earshot of the music that still played on in the background. I pulled out the first aid kit and ripped off the ruined sleeve that had hung on by a thread. The disinfectant burned when it hit the wound, but it did its job, and after I slapped a band-aid across it, I quickly scanned the woods around me. There still didn't seem to be anyone out there yet, but I felt like we should probably just leave right away and come back tomorrow under daylight to clean up. As I walked back to the camp, I started to notice something was off. The closer I got, the louder the music became, yet I heard no voices speaking. Only the sound of cheesy Halloween music was heard as I walked down that dirt path. That was the same music that must have dampened any of the struggle. It was when I approached the edge of the campsite that I saw the first body. I couldn't even tell who it was, as their face had been mangled beyond recognition, almost looking like a smashed pumpkin. I didn't have that knife anymore, but I still ran into the camp. All around were the remains of my friends. It looked like they had been put into a blender. Body parts were strewn across the campsite, organs hung from nearby tree branches, and standing there in the middle of it all was Lillian. Her head tilted back and scanned around the scene like she was admiring a work of art. When I finally saw her face, I could see that it had a smile across it, one that only blossomed when she spotted me. I tried to ask her what happened, but couldn't muster the words when I looked at her. I realized that her body was covered in blood again, but this time it was fresh. There were no signs of those symbols on her, though. Not a single one was left visible. I took a few steps back from her and fell to my ass as she approached. She still sported that smile as she leaned down in front of me. Carefully, she put her hands on my head, pulled my head forward against her lips, kissing the inverted cross. When she let go, I felt a searing pain in my skull and fell onto the ground in agony. All I could do then was watch with my head turned to the side as she walked off into the forest. The last words I heard from her before I slipped into unconsciousness were, "Thank you for helping me. I won't forget that." I was woken up the next day by police officers that had been called out after numerous reports of kids not returning home the morning after. What followed was a blur. I told them my story, and of course they didn't initially believe me. It was only when they did a search of the woods did they stumble across the remains of the cultist. They too were dead, and in much worse ways than my friends were. I never got the details of what had happened to them, but a few of the cops who had been on the crime scene ended up quitting only a couple months later. The entire event was ultimately chalked up to a fanatical group going crazy in the woods, killing each other and stumbling across an unfortunate group of teenagers who were having a party nearby. I was only left alive due to my costume, they said. My unconscious body must have looked already dead. I knew better, though. Turns out the cross had been burned into my forehead. I grew my hair over it, but whenever someone catches a glance of it, I know what they must think. It doesn't look like a scar. The clean edges of the inverted cross are almost good enough to call a tattoo. Every Halloween night since then, I wonder what really happened in those woods. I wonder if that man in the robes was really about to murder a girl in cold blood, or if he was trying to stop something that they had brought into this world, but couldn't contain.
So this happened on Halloween when I was about 11. My friend and I decided to go out trick-or-treating. I lived in a very nice neighborhood, one of the ones where everyone gives out the full-size candy bars, so it wasn't unusual to have a lot of people come there to trick-or-treat. However, that also meant there's about an acre of front yard for each house, so it took about 3 minutes to walk between each door. It was a good night for Halloween weather-wise. Not too chilly, not rainy or anything. So it's approaching 8:30 p.m., and after hanging around on the golf course and appreciating our candy haul, we decided to start heading home and call it a night. The street I live on is a gigantic U-shape, like a little over half a mile walk from the top of the U down the bend to the other side. We were walking towards the end of the U further from my house, as we wanted to take the long way since it was such a nice night. It's about 9 p.m., so no one else is really out anymore at this point, and people turned off their porch lights, the universal sign for no more trick-or-treaters. That's when we notice a lone white van parked on the street. We made a joke how it looks like the typical kidnap van with the painted windows. That's when we notice it shift out of the park and slowly creep down the street towards us and park at the next house. Oh, they must have kids for trick-or-treating. It wasn't uncommon for people to drive their kids from house to house since they were so spread out in our neighborhood. Given that it was 9 p.m. and a night with nice weather, it struck us as a bit odd, though. We checked every few minutes, and it seemed to just be stopping from the house to house like normal. We turned around again and kept walking at a leisurely pace, gossiping and whatnot. That's when we hear the car squeal as it moved towards down the hill and park again, this time only about 2 houses away from us on the opposite side of the street. Again, weird time to trick or treat, but whatever. That's when we realized there were no kids getting out of the van, not once. Now this was before my first phone. We were only 15 minutes away from my house, but a bit disturbed at this. So we walked to the nearest door, rang the bell, and stuck out our bags in an attempt to act normal. A woman opens the door just a crack, and proceeds to berate us for trying to trick or treat at this hour, and slams the door before we could even say a word. Okay, thank you, lady. We turn around, and the van is right there, parked in the wrong direction on our side of the street. The windows are tinted, so we can't even see the guy driving. Trying to keep our cool, we casually walk away from the door and up the street into this cul-de-sac that loops on the side of the street that makes up the bigger U. If you cut through that loop and hop a couple of fences, you can end up at my back door. The van goes the same way as us. Now we know he's following us since there's no reason for him to go up this street otherwise. We break into a sprint, and I am by no means athletic, but I hop those fences like an Olympian. We run inside my house, lock all the doors, and freak out while we sit in the front hall. Not 5 minutes later, the van slowly drives down the street past my house. We stress eat our candy and think of what would have happened if we hadn't been aware of our surroundings. Fake trick-or-treater man with the creepy white van. Let's not meet. Ever again. Halloween has, unfortunately, never been a big deal out here in Scotland, and that's always bummed me out because I do love Halloween. But after this year, I think I'll be happy never celebrating it again. My street and the next street over have a lot of young kids who go out trick-or-treating. So while I was out shopping all day with my mom, we decided to pick up some sweets in case someone came over to our door. I had plans to go to the cinema to see Ouija with my boyfriend. So when I got home, I was getting myself ready to go out, and my mom was busy putting the shopping away. So when the first load of kids came to the door, I was the one who answered it. There were children from our street, the next one over, and some I couldn't recognize as well as an adult at the end of the path. And they were dressed all in black, and had some sort of mask covering their face, but it wasn't anything I recognized from a movie or anything. Anyway, they all told me their jokes, and I gave them their treats, and they made their way back down the path onto the next house. I was about to close the door when I noticed that the guy with the kids was still standing at the end of my path. He hadn't noticed, and he wasn't watching the child either. He was looking right at me, and my skin started to crawl when I realized that he was just staring at me. I backed slowly into the house and watched him as he raised his hand and waved slowly at me. And I was about to call out to him when my mom came to the door and made sure that I was all right. He took off in the opposite way from the children. He hadn't been with them at all, and he left as soon as he realized that I wasn't home alone. I was completely freaked out and told my boyfriend all about it when he came to the house to pick me up, but I quickly forgot all about it when we were watching the movie. When I finally got home, it was getting really late, and trick-or-treating was well and truly over around here. When I got inside, my mom was just getting ready to take the dogs out for a walk, so that they would do their last-minute business, and they would meet my dad on the way back home from work. So I was going to be home alone. After my horrible encounter posted on here, I don't really like being home alone, but it's worse on Halloween, and it always has been. Anyway, I was home alone, and I grabbed some snacks and went up to my bedroom and onto my computer so that I could do some of my writing, scroll through Tumblr, and listen to my music. After my first creepy encounter with the guys coming into my house and into my backyard, my dad bought a motion-censored light and attached it to the wall of our house right outside my window. Normally it will go off whenever a cat walks along our fence, but it will usually go off after a couple of minutes. I always know when the light has come on because it lights up my whole room, given where it's placed. And while I was sitting at my computer, the light came on. I ignored it at first because I knew that it would go off soon, but 5 minutes passed and it still hadn't gone off. So I opened up my blinds to look outside and see what was going on. My stomach almost fell out of my ass when I looked out and saw the creep from hours before sitting on the fence, waving at my window to keep the light on. His waving slowed down suddenly when he spotted me. And it was all seriously creepy again. And I didn't know what to do. I just got flashbacks from before. Luckily, I heard the front door open and my parents coming into the house with the dogs, so I rushed down the stairs and started screaming at them about the guy on the fence. My dad didn't question me. He took the dogs and rushed through the house, threw the back door open, and ran outside, and then I heard him shouting, "Get the fuck out of here, you creep! I'm going to phone the police!" Dad scared him off, but I convinced him not to call the police because I didn't want to relive the whole thing over again. I just wanted to go to sleep and forget all about that whole night. So, to the creepy guy in the mask waving at me from the end of the path and sitting on my fence, let's not meet again.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.